Hi everybody, Professor Charlie Collins here. Welcome to Introduction to Community Psychology. This will be your first mini lecture of the quarter, and this lecture is about Introduction to Community Psychology. So I'll be providing you a brief intro to the field of community psychology, as well as give you some grounding frameworks, or I should say one single grounding framework that we use for the field. And so today what I'll be talking about is first, I want to define community psychology. It is a unique subfield within the larger field of psychology. I also want to talk about agency versus structure, and I will finally end on talking about ecological levels of analysis. So what is community psychology? So we think of psychology typically in the broad sense as the study of individual behavior. Right, and what that is individuals' cognitions, thoughts, skills, personality, so on and so forth. The focus there is on the individual, right? So then when we add community to that, we think of community as some shared grouping of individuals, right? So people who share some common goal, some common interest, some commonality in some way. Or some other type of linkage. So when we put those together, community psychology then is a focus on the individual in relationship to community. And to put that a different way, what we are really interested in community psychology is the ways in which community, really broadly defined, shapes individual behavior. And we're also interested in the flip side of that of how does individual behavior or individual agency shape community? And so we can look at both sides of that coin within community psychology. And so let's talk about agency versus structure, right? So agency is individuals' life courses that are shaped by their own personal traits, right? Personality, skills, behavior. In the US, we tend to have a culture that is based around agency. So we sort of firmly believe that individuals can do whatever they want, right? If you have the drive, you can do whatever you want. However, structure is the flip side of that, where we think about individuals' life courses being shaped by context, right? And so it's also sort of this nature versus nurture type of argument. It's slightly different than nature versus nurture, but the structure is thinking about how individuals' socio-political status or systems shape their behavior or shape their life courses, right? So class, race, gender, those sorts of things. And so community psychology then is a shift from that individualist perspective or that agency perspective toward a more ecological structural perspective, right? And so we're interested in the ways in which communities, societies, individuals are all intertwined and shape and inform each other, right? Whereas traditional quote unquote traditional psychology, or psychology in the traditional sense, is really primarily focused on the individual, right? Individuals' cognitions, behaviors, skills, personality, so on and so forth. And so, we can think about psychology, community psychology, as a larger way to intervene in problems and social problems, right? So while traditional psychology might look at something like therapy or drugs as a way to address individual issues, we look at potential structures to address those issues, right? So an individual's perspective might say somebody might become homeless because of a mental illness, right? Whereas from the structural level, we think about homelessness in terms of context, right? Lack of affordable housing, lack of a living wage, for example, right? And so the community psych perspective, that structural perspective is an ecological perspective. And the reason that's important is because we can create interventions at different layers of a structure to potentially have greater impact across individuals. And so let's talk a little bit about those levels, right? Those levels of analyses. And so this was adapted from another textbook by Dalton and Wandersman. You can look it up. It's Individual and Community, I believe is the title of it. And so the way that community psychologists think is we've adapted or adopted what's called an ecological model by a developmental psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And so this ecological model has different levels of analysis, right? So we have individuals at the center of this. And so when we think about individuals, we're thinking about individual skills, capacities, and in creating interventions toward individual level is really about building capacity to address individual issues, right? A little broader out is microsystems. And so these are settings where the individual, the sort of, we call it the focal individual, engages in direct and personal interaction with other people. So these are settings with informal rules. And so these are like families, friends, work groups, classrooms, things like that, right? In places where you interact one-on-one with other people. At a different level, organizations tend to have a formal structure and they may host several microsystems. And so these are places like schools, local businesses, church congregations, religious services, sports teams, right? Something that has sort of formal structure to it. Localities can be like organizations, but they tend to contain many organizations, and so it's a sort of a higher level up. Localities are things like geographic communities, right? And so they consist of many microsystems and many organizations, and in localities, history and culture are important. And then finally, macro systems are the larger levels of analysis. So things like policy, social norms, legislation, government, mass media, beliefs, right? And the thing about macro systems is they influence all the other systems, right? And the reason it's important to understand these systems is because community psychologists at our core are interventionists, right? And so what that means is our goal is to intervene at some level of analysis in order to address some problem, some social problem, right? And so what we can do is we can look at multiple problems and also multiple solutions to those problems by looking at across those levels, right? So we ask questions like, how can we shift policy, for example, to affect the greatest number of people? How can we shift the structure of an organization or organizations in order to address an issue and affect the greatest number of people, right? So we're trying to look at those higher levels of analysis to intervene in specific social problems. All right, and so what I want you to take from this is the ecological framework is a real core grounding of the field of community psychology. And so it's something that's going to come up over and over and over again in our discussions throughout the quarter. So keep this ecological model in your mind because it's going to highly influence a lot of what we do throughout this quarter and influence the way that we understand social problems.